In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless species have risen and fallen, where empires span star systems, and technology defies the very laws of physics, there exists a simple truth that echoes through the halls of power. Never judge a warrior by the scars on their armor, for those scars tell a story of survival that most will never understand. What happens when the most advanced civilizations in the universe encounter something they cannot compute, cannot categorize, and cannot comprehend? What occurs when beings who have mastered faster-than-light travel, who have bent reality to their will, who have conquered death itself, come face to face with a species that should have been extinct 1,000 times over? This is the story of Marcus Chun, a human soldier whose battered, jury-rigged armor became the symbol of something far more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. This is the tale of the day. An entire galactic council learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't what advanced technology can create. It's what desperation can overcome. In the halls where gods among mortals decide the fate of worlds, where beings of pure energy deliberate alongside machine consciousnesses older than solar systems, one damaged human in patched armor would change everything. Not with superior technology, not with ancient wisdom, but with something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. Because when humanity has nothing left to lose, when their backs are against the wall and extinction beckons, they don't surrender. They don't negotiate. They don't even hope for mercy. They adapt. They survive. And they make the impossible possible. The Galactic Council chamber stretched beyond the horizon of most species' comprehension, its crystalline walls reaching toward infinity while displaying the swirling dance of a million stars. Representatives from across the known galaxy filled the vast space, their forms as diverse as the worlds they called home. Beings of pure energy flickered alongside ancient mechanical consciousnesses, while aquatic delegates floated in specialized atmospheric bubbles next to crystalline entities that communicated through light frequencies. At the center of it all sat the High Arbiters, 5 beings chosen to represent the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Their combined knowledge spanned eons. Their technology had reshaped the very fabric of space-time, and their decisions affected the lives of trillions across thousands of worlds. Today, they would decide the fate of a species that had been nothing more than a footnote in galactic records until recently. The humans. Prime Arbiter Zephyros, a being of shifting plasma whose form constantly reformed itself in patterns of blue and gold, spoke first. His voice resonated through quantum frequencies that reached every consciousness in the chamber simultaneously. We convene today to address the application of the species known as humanity for inclusion in the Galactic Cooperative. Their representative will present their case for membership. A ripple of what could only be described as amusement passed through the gathered delegates. The Veltar contingent, masters of biotechnology who had evolved beyond physical form centuries ago, pulsed with colors that indicated barely contained laughter. The Chronari, machine beings whose intelligence had grown beyond organic limitations, emitted harmonics that served as their equivalent of chuckling. High Arbiter Nexus, a crystalline being whose thoughts moved at the speed of light through quantum networks, projected words that appeared as floating text visible to all species regardless of their sensory limitations. The humans, a species barely out of their own solar system. Their fastest vessels require months to travel distances our children cross in hours. Their weaponry operates on chemical propulsion and nuclear fusion. Primitive does not begin to describe their technological level. Indeed, added Arbiter Korvash, whose mechanical form had been upgraded and modified for over 10,000 years. Our preliminary scans indicate they have not even achieved consciousness transfer. They remain bound to biological forms that fail after a mere 100 rotations around their star. How can such limitations possibly contribute to our collective? Arbiter Lorana, a being of pure thought who had transcended physical existence millennia ago, manifested her presence as a gentle glow that somehow conveyed maternal concern. Perhaps we should not dismiss them entirely. Their mathematical achievements show promise, and their artistic expressions demonstrate a creativity that could prove valuable in our cultural exchanges. Cultural exchanges? The 5th Arbiter, Omnarch, whose form existed partially outside normal space-time dimensions, seemed to flicker in and out of reality as he spoke. They have not even unified their own planet. Their species remains divided into competing nation-states that engage in primitive warfare. What culture could such chaos produce that would benefit civilizations that have achieved perfect harmony for thousands of years? The murmur of agreement from the assembled delegates was overwhelming. Species that had mastered interstellar travel before humanity had discovered fire nodded in approval. Beings who had solved death itself looked down upon a species that still struggled with disease and aging. The consensus was clear. Humanity had nothing to offer that the galaxy needed or wanted. Nevertheless, Prime Arbiter Zephyros stated with the patience of one who had overseen galactic politics for longer than human civilization had existed, "The laws of the cooperative are absolute. Every species that achieves faster-than-light travel and requests membership must be given the opportunity to present their case. We will hear from their representative." A section of the chamber floor shimmered and transformed into a platform that rose toward the center of the space. The environmental controls adjusted automatically, creating an atmosphere suitable for carbon-based life forms. Gravity generators activated to provide the specific conditions the human delegate would require. What materialized on that platform drew gasps, clicks, harmonics, and energy fluctuations from across the chamber that served as expressions of shock and disbelief among the various species present. The human representative was a soldier. That much was immediately apparent. But the state of his equipment told a story that none of the advanced beings in the chamber had expected to see. His armor was a patchwork of repairs, jury-rigged modifications, and improvised additions that defied every principle of advanced engineering. Sections of the suit were clearly cobbled together from different sources, creating a hodgepodge appearance that seemed to mock the elegant technologies surrounding it. Cables and wires were visible through gaps in the armor plating, held in place by what appeared to be primitive adhesive compounds. The surface was scarred with blast marks, laser burns, and impact damage that spoke of countless battles. Some repairs were so crude that they appeared to have been made with hand tools under field conditions. Marcus Chun stood at attention in the center of the platform, his helmet under one arm, revealing a face that bore its own collection of scars. His dark hair was regulation short, his brown eyes steady despite the overwhelming presence of beings whose power dwarfed anything humanity had ever conceived. But it was his armor that drew every gaze, every sensor, every analytical system in the chamber. "Behold," whispered Arbiter Nexus, his words manifesting in glowing text that somehow conveyed disdain, "the representative of humanity. A warrior whose equipment appears to have been assembled in a scrapyard." The Veltar delegation pulsed with colors indicating genuine confusion. How could a species that claimed to have achieved interstellar flight produce such primitive equipment? The Chronari ran immediate scans, their results confirming what visual inspection had already suggested. The human's armor was a technological nightmare, a collection of incompatible systems somehow forced to work together through methods that violated every principle of proper engineering. "The energy readings are inconsistent," reported one of the Chronari observers, his mechanical voice tinged with what his species considered embarrassment on behalf of another. "The power distribution network appears to have been rewired multiple times using substandard materials. The life support systems are operating at barely 50% efficiency. The entire suit should have failed catastrophically long ago." High Arbiter Korvash leaned forward, his ancient sensors focusing on the human with something approaching scientific curiosity. "Representative of humanity, your equipment appears to be in a state of near-complete failure. Is this typical of your species' technological achievements?" Marcus Chin's response was delivered in a calm, steady voice that carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "High Arbiters, honor delegates, this armor has carried me through 47 combat operations across 12 star systems. It has been my companion through the vacuum of space, the crushing depths of ocean worlds, and the burning atmosphere of gas giants. Every repair, every modification, every jury-rigged solution represents a moment when the impossible was made possible." The chamber fell silent. Not the respectful silence of beings contemplating profound wisdom, but the uncomfortable quiet of those witnessing something they couldn't quite classify. The human was speaking of his damaged equipment with something approaching reverence, as if the very failures and repairs were badges of honor rather than evidence of technological inadequacy. Arbiter Lorana's glow shifted to patterns indicating gentle concern. Surely your species possesses the technology to provide properly functioning equipment to its representatives? This armor appears to be held together by little more than determination and primitive repair techniques. With respect, honored Arbiter, Marcus replied, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled delegates. This armor has never failed me. Not once. Not when I was floating in the void after our transport was destroyed by pirates in the Centauri system. Not when I was trapped for 6 days beneath a collapsed structure on New Geneva while rescue crews worked to reach survivors. Not when we held the line at the Battle of Wolf's Gate against odds that should have been impossible. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's plasma form shifted to patterns indicating puzzlement. You speak of these equipment failures as if they were somehow beneficial. Any of our civilizations could provide you with armor that would eliminate such problems entirely. Why do you cling to technology that clearly does not function as intended? Marcus Chun was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving across the vast chamber with its impossible architecture and the beings whose very presence bent the laws of physics. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that somehow seemed to fill the enormous space despite its human limitations. Because this armor doesn't just protect my body, honored delegates. It tells the story of every mission where we refused to surrender, every battle where we found a way to survive, every moment when giving up would have been easier than pressing forward. You see damaged equipment. I see proof that humanity doesn't break when things go wrong. We adapt. We overcome. We make do with what we have and turn it into what we need. The Veltar delegation's color patterns shifted to hues indicating deep confusion. The concept the human was attempting to convey didn't translate properly into their advanced consciousness. Why would a species choose to continue using failing equipment when superior alternatives existed? High Arbiter Nexus projected words that glowed with increasing brightness as his attention focused on the human. Your species appears to have developed an emotional attachment to technological failure. This suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of advancement. Technology exists to eliminate problems, not to celebrate them. You misunderstand, honored Arbiter, Marcus responded, his tone remaining respectful, but gaining an edge that hadn't been present before. We don't celebrate failure. We celebrate survival. Every repair on this armor represents a moment when someone refused to accept death as inevitable. Every jury rig modification is evidence that when our equipment failed, we didn't stop fighting. We made it work anyway. Arbiter Omnarch, whose existence spanned multiple dimensions, seemed to focus more of his attention on the human, his form becoming slightly more stable in normal space-time. Explain this concept of survival that you emphasize. Our civilizations have transcended such primitive concerns. We have eliminated death, suffering, and want. What relevance does survival have to beings who have achieved permanence? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the chamber, delegates from species that had conquered every conceivable form of hardship waited for an answer that would undoubtedly reveal humanity's fundamental misunderstanding of advanced civilization. They had moved beyond such primitive concepts as struggle and adaptation. They had achieved perfection, harmony, and eternal existence. Marcus Chun looked directly at Arbiter Omnarch, meeting the gaze of a being whose power could unmake solar systems with a thought. His response would echo through galactic history for generations to come. Because, honored Arbiter, the universe doesn't care about your perfection. It doesn't respect your technology or your transcendence. When everything you've built fails, when your perfect systems break down, when the impossible happens and the unthinkable becomes reality, survival isn't just relevant. It's the only thing that matters. And on that day, you're going to want someone on your side who knows how to make broken things work anyway. The chamber erupted into chaos. Energy beings flared with indignation. Mechanical consciousnesses emitted harmonics of disbelief, and crystalline entities pulsed with patterns indicating everything from amusement to outrage. The human had just suggested that their perfect civilizations were somehow inadequate, that their transcendence was incomplete. But in that chaos, a few beings remained silent, their ancient minds turning over concepts that they hadn't considered in millennia. What had happened when perfect systems failed? What occurred when transcendent civilizations encountered something their perfection couldn't overcome? Marcus Chun stood motionless in the center of the platform, his damaged armor catching the light from a million stars, waiting for the next question that would determine humanity's place in the galaxy. The chaos in the chamber gradually subsided as Prime Arbiter Zephyros exerted his authority, his plasma form shifting to patterns that demanded silence. The countless delegates slowly returned their attention to the central platform, where the human representative stood unchanged, his posture steady despite having just challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. Representative Chun. Prime Arbiter Zephyros began, his voice carrying the weight of eons. Your words suggest that you believe advanced civilizations such as ours are somehow unprepared for unexpected difficulties. This borders on the absurd. Our combined knowledge spans millions of years. Our technology has eliminated every conceivable threat to existence. We have transcended the limitations that bind primitive species. Marcus nodded respectfully, but his expression remained unchanged. I'm not questioning your achievements, honored Arbiter. I'm simply stating a fact that every soldier learns in their first combat operation. No plan survives contact with reality. No matter how advanced your technology, no matter how perfect your preparations, the universe will eventually present you with a situation you didn't anticipate. High Arbiter Corvash's mechanical form word as his processing cores focused entirely on the human. Provide a specific example of this supposed inadequacy in advanced preparation. Our civilizations have faced every challenge the universe has presented for millennia. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the assembled delegates before settling back on the High Arbiters. 3 months ago, our colony ships encountered something your databases classify as impossible. We call them the Devourers. The change in the chamber's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Energy beings flickered with patterns indicating sudden attention. Mechanical consciousnesses adjusted their processing priorities, and crystalline entities pulsed with frequencies suggesting alarm. Several species began transmitting data requests to their home worlds simultaneously. Arbiter Lorana's gentle glow shifted to patterns indicating deep concern. The reports we received suggested that humanity had encountered an unknown hostile force, but our analysis indicated the threat was contained and eliminated. You're suggesting otherwise. The threat was neutralized, Marcus confirmed, but not by superior technology or advanced planning. The Devourers were unlike anything in your databases because they weren't just another species with different technology. They were something that actively consumed organized energy patterns. They fed on the very complexity that makes advanced civilizations possible. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's form shifted to configurations indicating intense focus. Elaborate on this claim. Our physicists have found no evidence of such entities in the fundamental laws of the universe. Marcus gestured toward his damaged armor, the movement causing several jury-rig components to shift slightly. That's because your physicists assume that the fundamental laws are permanent. The Devourers weren't bound by the same physical constants that govern normal matter. They existed in a state of organized entropy that allowed them to break down any system that relied on stable energy patterns. The Veltar delegation pulsed with colors indicating deep alarm. Their entire civilization was based on biotechnology that manipulated organized energy patterns. If such entities truly existed, they represented an existential threat to everything their species had become. High Arbiter Nexus projected words that blazed with urgent intensity. You claim to have encountered entities that could break down organized energy. Yet you stand before us alive, your primitive equipment intact. How is this possible? Because our primitive equipment doesn't rely on the same principles as your advanced technology, Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength. When the Devourers attacked our colony fleet, every sophisticated system failed within minutes. The AI cores that managed our navigation simply dissolved into random data. The energy shields that protected our ships collapsed as their control matrices were consumed. The automated defense systems stopped functioning as their targeting computers were reduced to electronic noise. Arbiter Omnarch, his multidimensional existence, focused more completely on the human than it had been on any single entity for centuries, manifested his voice with unusual clarity. Continue. Our fleet was dying, Marcus said simply. 17 colony ships, each carrying 50,000 civilians, were being systematically disassembled by entities that fed on the very technology that kept us alive. Our commanders were dead, their neural implants consumed along with their knowledge. Our engineers were helpless as systems they'd spent their lives mastering simply ceased to exist. The chamber had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient energy patterns that normally provided background illumination had dimmed as every being present focused entirely on the human's words. But this armor didn't fail, Marcus continued, touching the scarred surface of his chest plate. These jury-rigged systems didn't stop working because they're not sophisticated enough for the Devourers to consider them organized energy. The manual backup systems that you see as primitive weren't affected because they operate below the threshold of complexity that the entities could perceive. High Arbiter Corvash's sensors swept over the human's equipment with newfound interest. You're suggesting that technological sophistication became a liability when facing these entities? I'm stating it as fact, Marcus replied firmly. While your perfect energy beings were being consumed, while your mechanical consciousnesses were dissolving in a chaos, while every advanced system in the fleet was failing, human soldiers in damaged armor were still fighting. Because our equipment is so primitive, so jury-rigged, so imperfect that it fell below their notice. The implications of what the human was describing began to sink in throughout the chamber. Species that had achieved technological transcendence realized that their very advancement might make them vulnerable to threats that could simply ignore primitive alternatives. Arbiter Lorana's glow shifted to patterns indicating something approaching fear. How did you ultimately defeat these entities? Marcus's expression hardened, and for the first time since he'd materialized on the platform, something like pain flickered across his features. We didn't defeat them. We survived them. There's a difference. Explain this difference, Prime Arbiter Zephyros commanded, his plasma form shifting to configurations indicating maximum attention. Defeat implies that you overcome your enemy through superior force or strategy, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a nightmare. We couldn't do either. The Devourers were immune to our weapons because our weapons relied on organized energy patterns. They were immune to our strategies because they could consume the very computers we used to coordinate our tactics. We couldn't fight them directly because they were everything our understanding of physics said was impossible. Then, how did you ensure the survival of your colonies? Arbiter Omnarch asked, his multidimensional perception focusing on details that existed beyond normal space-time. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that somehow filled the vast chamber despite its human limitations. We did what humans do when the impossible becomes inevitable. We improvised. We adapted. We found a way to survive that had nothing to do with superior technology or perfect planning. Describe your solution, High Arbiter Nexus demanded, his crystalline form pulsing with urgent light. We realized that the Devourers were attracted to organized complexity, Marcus explained, his hand unconsciously moving to touch a particularly crude repair on his armor's shoulder. So we made ourselves too chaotic to notice. We deliberately broke our own systems. We introduced random failures into every piece of technology we had left. We turned our ships into technological disasters that barely functioned. The assembled delegates listened with growing amazement as the human described a tactical approach that violated every principle of advanced warfare they understood. We shut down our main computers and switched to manual control systems that required constant human intervention. We disabled our energy shields and relied on crude armor plating that had to be constantly repaired. We abandoned coordinated fleet tactics and broke into individual ships that moved according to plans that changed every few minutes. High Arbiter Corvash's processing cores struggled to comprehend the tactical framework the human was describing. You deliberately degraded your own capabilities to achieve victory. We deliberately degraded our technology to achieve survival, Marcus corrected. The devourers were so focused on consuming organized systems that they couldn't perceive the random, chaotic, constantly changing mess we turn ourselves into. While they were destroying the sophisticated defenses of other species, human ships held together by determination and prayer were slipping past them unnoticed. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's form shifted through patterns indicating deep contemplation. The concept the human was describing challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of advancement and progress that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. You're suggesting that primitiveness can be strategically advantageous, Arbiter Lorana said, her glow reflecting patterns of reluctant understanding. I'm suggesting that adaptability matters more than perfection, Marcus replied. When your perfect systems fail, when your transcendent technology becomes a liability, when the impossible happens and reality stops following the rules you've spent millennia mastering, the question isn't whether you can maintain perfection. The question is whether you can survive imperfection. The chamber erupted into discussion as delegates from across the galaxy began communicating with their homeworlds, sharing data, and analyzing the implications of what they'd heard. The humans' damaged armor was no longer an object of ridicule, but something approaching a tactical necessity that they'd never considered. Arbiter Omnarch, whose existence spanned realities that lesser beings couldn't comprehend, asked the question that had been growing in the minds of every advanced consciousness present. These devourers you describe, they were ultimately neutralized. How? Marcus Chen's expression grew grim, and for the first time since he'd appeared on the platform, his steady composure showed cracks. They weren't neutralized by anything we did. They simply moved on when they realized that our damaged, improvised, constantly failing technology wasn't worth consuming. We survived because we became too primitive to be worth their attention. And where are they now? Prime Arbiter Zephyros asked, though something in his energy patterns suggested he already feared the answer. Marcus met the gaze of each High Arbiter in turn before responding with words that would change the course of galactic history. According to our long-range sensors, they're moving toward the core systems of the galaxy, toward civilizations with technology so advanced, so perfect, so organized that they represent the richest feeding grounds these entities have ever encountered. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, every being in the chamber understood that the humans' damaged armor wasn't a symbol of primitive inadequacy. It was a preview of what survival might require when perfection itself became a death sentence. The silence in the chamber stretched for long moments as the implications of Marcus Chen's words settled into the consciousness of beings who had considered themselves beyond any conceivable threat. Energy entities flickered with unstable patterns. Mechanical minds processed scenarios they'd never needed to consider, and crystalline beings pulsed with frequencies that bordered on panic. Prime Arbiter Zephyros was the first to break the silence, his plasma form shifting through configurations that indicated both authority and uncertainty. Representative Chun, you're suggesting that these devourer entities represent a threat to civilizations across the galaxy. Yet you also claim that primitive technology may be the key to survival. Explain how this knowledge can be practically applied. Marcus straightened, his damaged armor reflecting the light from countless stars visible through the chamber's crystalline walls. With respect, honored Arbiter, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm reporting what happened. The question isn't whether this knowledge can be applied. The question is whether advanced civilizations are capable of deliberately becoming less advanced when survival depends on it. High Arbiter Korvash's mechanical form hummed with processing activity as his ancient consciousness struggled with concepts that challenged millennia of technological evolution. Your proposal appears to be that we deliberately regress our capabilities. This contradicts every principle of progress and development that has guided galactic civilization since its founding. Progress and development are tools, Marcus replied calmly. When those tools become liabilities, you find new ones. When advancement becomes vulnerability, you adapt your definition of strength. The question is whether your species can conceive of strength that doesn't depend on technological superiority. Arbiter Lorana's gentle glow shifted to patterns indicating deep concern mixed with growing understanding. You're describing a fundamental reevaluation of what it means to be an advanced civilization. But Surely there must be alternatives to abandoning the achievements of millions of years of progress. Marcus gestured toward his armor again, the movement causing several improvised components to shift and realign themselves automatically. Look at this equipment, Honored Arbiter. Really look at it. What you see as abandonment of achievement, I see as the ultimate expression of technological mastery. Every repair, every modification, every jury-rigged system represents a moment when a human engineer looked at impossible constraints and found a way to make something work anyway. The Veltar delegation pulsed with colors indicating growing confusion. Their entire biological matrix was based on perfect integration of energy patterns. The concept of deliberately introducing chaos into their systems was fundamentally incomprehensible to their evolved consciousness. Representative Chun, one of the Veltar speakers projected through bioelectric fields, your species appears to celebrate inefficiency as if it were a virtue. How can deliberately imperfect systems be superior to optimized alternatives? Marcus turned toward the Veltar delegation, his expression reflecting patience tinged with something approaching sympathy. Because optimized systems are predictable. They follow rules. They operate within parameters that can be calculated, analyzed, and ultimately consumed. When you encounter something that operates outside those parameters, your perfect systems become perfect targets. High Arbiter Nexus projected words that blazed with urgent intensity. Provide specific examples of how this primitive approach could be implemented by advanced civilizations. We require practical applications, not philosophical abstractions. Your defensive systems, Marcus began, his voice taking on the tone of a military briefer addressing strategic commanders, rely on coordinated energy shields that maintain perfect coverage across predetermined zones. The Devourers consumed them by targeting the coordination protocols. A primitive alternative would be randomly overlapping barrier fields that change configuration constantly without central coordination. Inefficient, wasteful, and unpredictable enough to be invisible to entities that feed on organized patterns. Around the chamber, military advisors from dozens of species began transmitting urgent communications to their homeworlds, sharing the tactical implications of what the human was describing. Your computer systems, Marcus continued, integrate perfectly with each other to maximize efficiency and eliminate redundancy. The Devourers could consume entire networks by targeting the integration protocols. A primitive alternative would be isolated, incompatible systems that require constant manual intervention to operate together. Clumsy, inefficient, and chaotic enough to fall below the detection threshold of entities that perceive organized complexity as food. Arbiter Omnarch, his multidimensional consciousness focusing more completely on the human than on anything else in recent memory, manifested his voice with crystalline clarity. You're describing the deliberate introduction of failure points into every critical system. This represents a complete reversal of engineering philosophy that has guided technological development across the galaxy. No, Marcus replied firmly. I'm describing the difference between systems that fail catastrophically when they encounter the unexpected and systems that continue functioning despite constant small failures. The first approach assumes that perfection is achievable and maintainable. The second approach assumes that failure is inevitable and plans accordingly. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's form shifted through patterns indicating deep contemplation mixed with growing alarm. The implications of implementing such an approach across galactic civilization would be staggering. Efficiency ratings would plummet, resource consumption would increase exponentially, and coordination between systems will become exponentially more complex. Yes, Marcus agreed simply. It would be expensive, inefficient, and frustrating. It would also keep your civilizations alive when they encounter something that feeds on the very complexity that makes efficiency possible. The chamber erupted into chaotic discussion as delegates began debating the practical implications of what they were hearing. Energy beings flickered between configurations, indicating everything from outrage to fascination, while mechanical consciousnesses emitted harmonics, suggesting computational overflow as they attempted to model the economic and social implications of deliberately degrading their technological infrastructure. High Arbiter Corvash raised his voice above the chaos, his mechanical tones cutting through the cacophony. Representative Chun, assuming your assessment is accurate, how long do our civilizations have before these devourer entities reach the core systems? Marcus's expression grew grim, and he consulted a primitive data device attached to his armor's wrist. Based on their movement patterns and the rate at which they consumed energy sources in the outer systems, our analysts estimate between 18 and 24 standard months before they reach the first core worlds. 18 months, Arbiter Lorana whispered, her glow dimming to patterns indicating something approaching despair. To restructure civilizations that have remained unchanged for millennia. To convince beings who have transcended physical existence to deliberately embrace primitive limitations. To abandon the achievements of millions of years of progress. Not abandon, Marcus corrected gently. Adapt. The knowledge doesn't disappear. The capability doesn't vanish. You simply learn to apply it in ways that don't create patterns these entities can perceive and consume. Arbiter Omnarka's multidimensional form seemed to flicker more rapidly as his consciousness processed implications that spanned realities beyond normal spacetime. You speak as if your species has experience with such adaptations. Has humanity encountered similar threats before? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried echoes of experiences that stretched beyond the current crisis. Every few generations, humanity encounters something that forces us to reinvent how we think about survival. Natural disasters that destroy our cities. Diseases that kill millions before we could develop treatments. Wars that force us to rebuild civilization from the ruins of what came before. We've learned that the species that survive aren't the ones with the best technology or the most perfect systems. They're the ones that can change fastest when change becomes necessary. The truth of what the human was describing began to sink in throughout the chamber. Species that had achieved technological transcendence realized that their very advancement might have eliminated their ability to adapt to threats they couldn't anticipate or understand. High Arbiter Nexus projected words that pulsed with growing urgency. Representative Chun, if we accept your assessment and agree to implement the changes you describe, how would such a massive undertaking be coordinated across thousands of worlds and millions of different technological systems? You don't coordinate it, Marcus replied, his statement causing a fresh wave of shocked reactions throughout the chamber. Coordination creates patterns that can be detected and consumed. Instead, you fragment it. Every world, every system, every species implements their own version of controlled chaos. No two solutions are identical. No patterns emerge that span multiple systems, and the diversity itself becomes a form of protection. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's form shifted through configurations indicating something approaching desperation. What you're describing would effectively end galactic civilization as we know it. The economic networks, the cultural exchanges, the scientific collaboration that binds our species together, all of it depends on coordinated systems that you're suggesting we abandon. I'm suggesting you modify them, Marcus clarified, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. Trade networks that route cargo through constantly changing pathways instead of optimized shipping lanes. Cultural exchanges that rely on personal contact instead of integrated communication networks. Scientific collaboration that uses physical transportation of data instead of shared databases. The practical implications were staggering. Civilizations that had operated with perfect efficiency for millennia would need to accept inefficiency, unpredictability, and constant adaptation as the price of survival. Arbiter Lorana's glow shifted to patterns indicating reluctant acceptance mixed with profound sadness. And if we refuse? If we choose to maintain our current systems and face these entities with the technology that has served us for so long? Marcus Chun looked directly at her, and for the first time since appearing on the platform, his composure showed the weight of what he'd witnessed. Then, you'll face the same choice our colony fleet faced when the Devourers first appeared. You can die as advanced civilizations, or you can survive as something less perfect but more adaptable. The silence that followed was broken only by the ambient sounds of energy patterns that powered the chamber's impossible architecture. In that quiet, every being present understood that they were witnessing the end of one era of galactic civilization and the potential beginning of something fundamentally different. There is Marcus said quietly. One more thing you need to understand about what's coming. Every consciousness in the chamber focused on him with desperate attention. The devourers we encountered were scouts. The word scouts hung in the air like a death sentence. Throughout the vast chamber, beings that had considered themselves beyond any conceivable threats suddenly understood that what they had perceived as a manageable crisis was merely the beginning of something far worse. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's plasma form flickered through configurations that indicated barely contained panic. Scouts? You're saying that the entities that consumed your outer colonies were not the primary threat. Marcus Chin's expression was grim as he accessed data from his primitive wrist device. The entities we encountered were small, relatively weak, and operating in isolation. Our scientists estimate they were approximately 1% the size and energy consumption capability of the signals we've detected moving through deep space toward the galactic core. High Arbiter Corvash's mechanical form shuddered as his processing cores struggled to comprehend the implications. If the scouts were capable of consuming organized energy systems of the sophistication you described, what level of threat do the primary entities represent? Based on our analysis, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. The main Devourer swarm contains entities large enough to consume the organized energy output of entire star systems. Not just the artificial technology, but the natural energy patterns that maintain stellar fusion, planetary orbits, and gravitational equilibrium. The chamber erupted into chaos as the true scope of the threat became clear. Energy beings began fragmenting into unstable patterns. Mechanical consciousnesses emitted discordant harmonics indicating system overload, and crystalline entities pulsed with frequencies that bordered on the ultrasonic range of panic. Arbiter Omnarch, whose multidimensional existence had remained stable through cosmic catastrophes that spanned galactic timescales, seemed to flicker more rapidly as his consciousness processed threats that operated beyond normal physical laws. You're describing entities capable of disrupting stellar mechanics. Such capabilities would represent a fundamental violation of thermodynamic principles that govern the universe. The universe apparently has principles we haven't discovered yet, Marcus said grimly. The Devourers don't just consume artificial technology. They feed on any form of organized energy, including the natural processes that maintain stellar stability. Our long-range sensors have detected 3 star systems along their approach vector that are already showing signs of premature stellar collapse. Arbiter Lorana's gentle glow dimmed to barely perceptible levels as she processed the implications. If these entities can consume stellar energy patterns, then no world, no system, no civilization would be safe regardless of their technological level. Even primitive species would face extinction. Not necessarily, Marcus replied, causing every consciousness in the chamber to focus on him with desperate attention. The entities appear to require a minimum threshold of organized complexity before they can perceive and consume energy patterns. Natural stellar fusion operates below that threshold. So does most biological activity. It's only when energy patterns become organized into artificial systems that they become visible to the Devourers. High Arbiter Nexus projected words that blazed with urgent intensity. You're suggesting that technological civilization itself is what makes systems vulnerable to consumption. I'm stating it as fact based on observed behavior, Marcus confirmed. The more sophisticated your technology, the brighter you appear to entities that feed on organized complexity. The more perfect your systems, the more attractive a target you become. The more advanced your civilization, the greater the threat you face. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's form shifted through patterns indicating growing desperation. Then, the solution you proposed earlier, the deliberate degradation of technological systems, it wouldn't be sufficient against entities of this magnitude. Marcus shook his head, his expression reflecting the weight of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. Against the scouts, primitive technology provided invisibility because we fell below their detection threshold. Against the primary swarm, we would need to reduce technological signatures to levels that approach pre-industrial civilization. The implications of what he was describing began to sink in throughout the chamber. Survival might require not just abandoning advanced technology, but abandoning technological civilization entirely. Representative Chun, Arbiter Omnarch said, his multidimensional voice carrying undertones of cosmic despair. You appear to be suggesting that the only way to survive this threat is to abandon everything that makes galactic civilization possible. Cities, transportation networks, communication systems, all of it would need to be eliminated or reduced to primitive levels. Not eliminated, Marcus clarified, though his expression suggested the distinction might be academic. Hidden, disguised, broken down into components so primitive and disorganized that they appear to be natural phenomena rather than artificial constructs. High Arbiter Corvash's sensors swept over the human's damaged armor with newfound understanding. Your equipment, it's not just primitive technology. It's a prototype for post-technological survival. Marcus nodded grimly. Every human soldier who survived the first of our encounters is wearing some version of this armor. It's become the template for what military equipment looks like when you need to fight entities that consume the very concept of advanced warfare. Around the chamber, delegates began to understand that the human's appearance wasn't a sign of technological inadequacy, but a glimpse into the future that awaited all galactic civilization if they intended to survive. Arbiter Lorana's glow brightened slightly as she asked the question that was forming in the minds of every conscious entity present. Is there any alternative? Any way to face this threat without abandoning advanced civilization entirely? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of military assessments that no one wanted to hear. Our strategic analysts have identified 3 possible approaches. The first is to fight the entities directly using advanced technology. Based on our encounters with the scouts, this approach has a projected survival rate of approximately 0%. And the second approach? Prime Arbiter Zephyros asked, though his energy patterns suggested he already feared the answer. Technological regression to pre-industrial levels, as we've discussed. This provides the highest probability of species survival, but requires abandoning every advancement achieved over the past several millennia. Projected survival rate for civilizations willing to implement this approach is approximately 60%. The third option, High Arbiter Nexus demanded. Marcus Chun looked directly at the assembled High Arbiters, his expression reflecting the gravity of what he was about to propose. Controlled fragmentation. Instead of maintaining unified civilizations that present large organized targets, we deliberately break apart into small, scattered, primitive communities that maintain minimal technology and no large-scale coordination. You're describing the complete dissolution of galactic society, Arbiter Omnarch stated, his multidimensional form flickering with patterns indicating profound disturbance. I'm describing what human military doctrine calls strategic dispersal, Marcus replied. When you can't defeat an enemy that targets large formations, you stop forming large formations. When you can't protect major installations, you stop building major installations. When you can't maintain complex supply lines, you learn to survive without them. The chamber fell silent as the assembled delegates contemplated futures that represented the abandonment of everything their civilizations had achieved. The choice wasn't between different tactical approaches to the same problem. The choice was between different definitions of what it meant to survive. High Arbiter Corvash's mechanical voice cut through the silence with a question that carried the weight of galactic history. Representative Chun, has humanity made this choice? Have your people decided which of these approaches to implement? Marcus's expression hardened, and, for the first time since appearing on the platform, something resembling anger flickered across his features. Humanity doesn't have the luxury of choosing between survival strategies based on what we want to preserve. We're implementing all 3 approaches simultaneously because we're not sure which one will work. Explain, Prime Arbiter Zephyros commanded. Our military forces are preparing for direct confrontation using every advanced weapon and defensive system we can deploy. Marcus began, his voice taking on the tone of a strategic briefing. We know it's probably suicide, but someone needs to buy time for the other approaches to be implemented. He paused, accessing data from his wrist device, before continuing. Our civilian populations are being relocated to worlds where they can establish pre-industrial communities capable of sustaining themselves without advanced technology. We're teaching children how to farm, how to build tools from raw materials, how to navigate by stellar positions instead of computer guidance. And the third approach? Arbiter Lorana asked softly. We're seeding the galaxy with small, hidden human colonies that will maintain minimal technology and no communication with each other. If the first two approaches fail, if our military is destroyed and our main populations are discovered and consumed, these scattered groups will represent the continuation of human civilization. The scope of what Marcus was describing began to register throughout the chamber. Humanity wasn't just preparing for the possibility of regression. They were implementing it across their entire species as a survival strategy. The question, Marcus said, his voice carrying a challenge that echoed through the vast space, is whether the other species of the galaxy are prepared to make similar choices. Because in 18 months, when the main devourer swarm reaches the core systems, abstract philosophical discussions about the value of advanced civilization won't matter. The only thing that will matter is whether your people are still alive to remember what you used to be. Prime Arbiter Zephyros's plasma form shifted through configurations that indicated a decision being reached. Representative Chun, humanity's application for membership in a galactic cooperative is granted with immediate effect. Furthermore, we formally request that human military advisors assist in developing survival strategies for all member species. With respect, Honored Arbiter Marcus replied, humanity doesn't want membership in the galactic cooperative. We want partnership with whatever civilizations are left after we survive what's coming. The distinction was subtle but profound. Membership implied joining an existing structure. Partnership implied building something new from whatever remained after the old structures were gone. As the chamber began to process the full implications of humanity's offer, Marcus Chun made one final statement that would define the next phase of galactic history. The universe is about to teach every advanced civilization the same lesson it taught humanity centuries ago. When everything you've built fails, when every plan falls apart, when the impossible becomes inevitable, survival doesn't depend on how advanced you were before the crisis. It depends on how adaptable you become after everything falls apart. 6 months after Marcus Chun had stood before the Galactic Council in his damaged armor, the galaxy looked fundamentally different. What had been perfect crystalline cities now resembled organized disasters, their gleaming spires deliberately broken into irregular clusters that defied any recognizable pattern. Energy networks that had operated with flawless efficiency for millennia now functioned through chaotic relay systems that changed configuration hourly. Transportation hubs that had coordinated the movement of billions of beings across thousands of worlds now operated like primitive markets where nothing functioned according to predetermined schedules. Marcus stood on the observation deck of what had once been the flagship of the Veltar defense fleet. The organic vessel had been deliberately infected with random growth patterns that transformed its elegant curves into a twisted mass of biological contradictions. Where perfect symmetry had once demonstrated the species' mastery of biotechnology, irregular protrusions now created a ship that looked more like a diseased organism than an advanced spacecraft. It feels wrong, admitted HFY, the Veltar commander whose consciousness had adapted to directing the chaos that their fleet had become. Her bioelectric patterns flickered with colors that indicated deep discomfort mixed with grudging acceptance. Every instinct my species has developed over millions of years tells me that this degradation is a step toward extinction rather than survival. Through the ship's modified sensory organs, they could observe the transformation taking place across the galaxy. The Chronari had abandoned their perfectly integrated mechanical forms for collections of crude, incompatible components that required constant manual intervention to function. Energy beings like the Arbiters had learned to deliberately fragment their consciousness into chaotic patterns that barely maintained coherence. Crystalline species had introduced random flaws into their matrix structures that made them appear more like natural mineral formations than artificial constructs. Your instincts aren't wrong, Marcus replied, his own discomfort visible in the way he unconsciously adjusted components on his armor that had become even more jury-rigged in the months since his appearance before the council. We are stepping toward extinction. The question is whether it's the extinction of advanced civilization or the extinction of every living thing in the galaxy. Through the ship's sensors, they watched as another star system implemented the controlled chaos protocols that had become standard across galactic civilization. Perfect orbital platforms were deliberately knocked into irregular paths that made them indistinguishable from asteroid fields. Communication networks were fragmented into isolated nodes that operated without coordination. Energy production facilities were disguised as natural phenomena through the introduction of random inefficiencies that made their organized output appear accidental. Status report from the outer monitoring stations announced the ship's communication officer, a being whose mechanical components had been so extensively modified with primitive elements that identifying his original species required careful observation. Long-range sensors indicate the main devourer swarm has consumed 3 more star systems along the approach vector. Estimated time to contact with outer defensive perimeters, 4 months. Marcus nodded grimly. 4 months to complete the most massive transformation in galactic history. 4 months to convince trillions of beings to abandon everything that had defined their civilizations for millennia. 4 months to discover whether survival was possible when perfection itself had become a death sentence. The defensive preparations? SYTHRA asked, though her bioelectric patterns suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. The Arbiters have established 17 chaotic warfare zones using technology so primitive and disorganized that our own forces can barely coordinate within them. Marcus reported, consulting the crude data displays that had replaced sophisticated information networks throughout the fleet. The Chronari have deployed weapon systems that operate on manual targeting and chemical propulsion. The crystalline entities have learned to project energy patterns so random and inefficient that they appear to be natural stellar phenomena. What Marcus didn't mention was what every military commander across the galaxy understood, but refused to acknowledge openly. Their defensive preparations were exercises in controlled desperation rather than legitimate military strategy. They were learning to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, because using both hands would attract the attention of entities that fed on coordination and effectiveness. And the civilian evacuations? SYTHRA pressed, her colors shifting to patterns that indicated she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. 60% of the core world populations have been relocated to primitive settlements that maintain no technology above pre-industrial levels, Marcus replied. Another 20% are in the process of relocating to scattered colonies that will maintain minimal contact with each other. The remaining 20%. He trailed off, leaving unspoken what everyone understood. The remaining 20% consisted of beings whose very existence depended on advanced technology. Energy entities who couldn't survive without sophisticated containment systems. Mechanical consciousnesses whose thought processes required computational resources that couldn't be disguised as natural phenomena. Crystalline beings whose matrix structures would collapse without organized energy inputs. They volunteered to maintain the defensive installations, SYTHRA said quietly, her bioelectric patterns dimming to levels that indicated profound sadness. They understand that someone needs to operate the systems that will buy time for the evacuation to be completed, even though those systems will make them primary targets. Marcus nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of command decisions that no military doctrine had ever prepared him to make. Across the galaxy, the most advanced beings in existence were volunteering for what amounted to suicide missions, not because they believed they could achieve victory, but because they understood that their sacrifice might allow more primitive survival strategies to succeed. Incoming priority transmission from the Galactic Defense Coordination Center, the communication officer announced, his voice carrying the tension that had become universal among beings learning to operate technology that deliberately malfunctioned. Prime Arbiter Zephyros materialized as a holographic projection, but his plasma form was so heavily fragmented and deliberately disorganized that he was barely recognizable. The being who had once embodied perfect energy control now appeared as a chaotic collection of barely contained forces that flickered unpredictably. Fleet commanders, Zephyros began, his voice distorted by the communication chaos protocols that made all transmissions appear random. Our deep space monitoring stations have detected a change in devourer behavior. The entities appear to be avoiding star systems that have implemented our defensive modifications. Marcus felt a moment of hope before logic reasserted itself. They're learning. The scout entities are reporting back to the main swarm, informing them that the galaxy is no longer the rich feeding ground they expected. Confirmed, Zephyros replied, his fragmented form flickering with patterns that might have indicated satisfaction under normal circumstances. The main swarm appears to be altering course toward galactic regions that still maintain advanced technological signatures. HFY's bioelectric patterns shifted to colors indicating growing alarm. The systems that haven't implemented the chaos protocols yet, or the systems that couldn't implement them, Marcus said grimly. The energy beings and mechanical consciousnesses that volunteered to maintain defensive installations. They're drawing the swarm toward them deliberately. The implications were staggering. The galaxy's most advanced beings weren't just sacrificing themselves to buy time. They were actively luring the devourers away from the primitive settlements where the majority of galactic civilization's population was learning to survive without technology. How long? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Based on the course corrections we've observed, Zephyros replied, the main swarm will reach the first defensive installations in approximately 6 weeks. The volunteer forces are requesting final coordination meetings to ensure their sacrifice achieves maximum strategic value. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, processing the reality that the galaxy's greatest military minds were meeting to plan the most effective way to commit civilizational suicide in service of a survival strategy that might not even work. Sir, the communication officer called out, his mechanical voice tinged with something that might have been awe. We're receiving transmissions from across the galaxy. Species that have never communicated directly with each other are sharing survival techniques, resource locations, and tactical adaptations. The chaos protocols are working, but they're also creating something we didn't expect. Explain, Marcus demanded. The breakdown of coordinated civilization is forcing direct cooperation between individual communities and scattered groups. Without large-scale communication networks, species are developing personal relationships with other species they've never interacted with before. Without efficient transportation, they're learning to help each other using local resources. Without advanced technology, they're discovering solutions that don't require perfect systems. HFY's bioelectric patterns shifted to colors indicating cautious optimism. You're saying that the forced regression is creating new forms of civilization rather than simply destroying existing ones. I'm saying that survival is teaching the galaxy something it forgot during millennia of perfect advancement. Marcus replied, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. How to adapt not just to external threats, but to each other. How to cooperate without coordination. How to maintain civilization without maintaining the systems that make civilization efficient. Through the ship's sensors, they observed another example of what the communication officer had described. On a world where energy beings and biological species had never successfully coexisted, the breakdown of their respective technological systems had forced them to develop mutual aid networks that operated through direct personal contact rather than coordinated institutional frameworks. Priority transmission from Defensive Installation 7, the communication officer announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The holographic image that appeared showed High Arbiter Corvash, but his mechanical form had been so extensively modified for the defensive mission that he was barely recognizable. Every perfect component had been replaced with crude, primitive alternatives that somehow maintained his consciousness while making him appear more like an industrial accident than an advanced artificial intelligence. Fleet commanders, Corvash began, his voice distorted by the degraded communication systems. The volunteer defensive forces are prepared to implement final protocols. We estimate that our sacrifice will provide approximately 18 months of operational security for the scattered populations to establish sustainable primitive communities. 18 months, Marcus repeated, the timeline settling into his consciousness like a countdown to the end of everything he'd known. 18 months to discover whether galactic civilization can survive by becoming something completely different. HFY added, her colors shifting to patterns that indicated acceptance, tinged with something that might have been hope. Corvash, Marcus said, addressing the High Arbiter directly. For what it's worth, humanity is honored to serve alongside beings who understand that true advancement sometimes requires the courage to step backward. The mechanical consciousness that had once embodied perfect computational efficiency flickered with harmonics that somehow conveyed gratitude. Representative Chun, humanity has taught the galaxy that survival is not about maintaining what you've achieved. It's about maintaining the ability to achieve something new when everything you've built is gone. The transmission ended, leaving Marcus and Deswaitichura alone on the observation deck of a ship that represented everything galactic civilization had become. Primitive, chaotic, inefficient, and utterly determined to survive whatever the universe could devise to destroy it. 18 months, Marcus said quietly, looking out at stars that would soon witness either the rebirth of galactic civilization in a form no one had ever imagined, or its final extinction despite every effort to prevent it. 18 months to discover, Swaitichura replied, her bioelectric patterns settling into colors that indicated grim determination, whether the universe respects adaptation more than it values perfection. Through the ship's sensors, they watched as defensive installations across the galaxy began broadcasting their final challenge to entities that fed on organized complexity, a deliberate display of the most advanced, most perfect, most irresistibly organized technology that galactic civilization could create. Not because they believed they could achieve victory, but because they understood that sometimes the greatest strategic achievement was knowing exactly how to lose in a way that allowed others to survive. In his damaged armor, surrounded by jury-rigged systems that had become the template for post-technological survival, Marcus Chun understood that he was witnessing the end of one chapter of galactic history and the uncertain beginning of another. The universe was about to discover whether intelligence could adapt faster than entropy could consume it. The hall had indeed gone quiet, but in that silence, something new was being born from the carefully controlled destruction of everything that had come before.